So first and foremost, welcome to another Chai Chat. My name is Maurice Cotman. I'm the Associate Director for the Student Center for Diversity and Inclusion. Chai Chats are a 1-hour bi-weekly conversation led by professionals. Recently, Title IX underwent large-scale changes. There have been a great deal of feedback related to modifications and how universities will adhere to said changes. Tonight, we have Paul Apicella, Drexel's Title IX coordinator, who has agreed to sit down with us and give us a little bit of time to help us navigate the new Title IX. Caroline, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Caroline. For those of you who don't know me, I think I know pretty much everyone here. But I am a senior at Drexel. I study interactive digital media. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I have been involved with the Student Center for Diversity and Inclusion since I was a sophomore. My primary role is working within the Women's Resource Center, but I am a student ambassador of the SCDI, so I work within all the different student spaces. And I guess for the past 2 years, we've been hosting an event called Hour of Power every other Tuesday, where the idea was just to congregate women from all different walks of life on Drexel's campus. So we found that there were a lot of organizations on campus that were catered towards women in business, women in engineering, women in medicine, but there was nothing that was just women. So we decided to create a social hour, an opportunity to connect with people across multiple disciplinaries and just get to know some familiar faces. We found some really amazing conversation coming out of those events, especially at the end of last term, where we were having upwards of 40 to 50 people at the Hour of Power events, which was amazing because at the beginning of winter term, it was myself and my 3 coworkers. So we saw some really great growth, and I saw an opportunity for these conversations to continue and be more meaningful now in this type of setting where access to knowledge and resources is more accessible than ever. So as different key themes keep coming up in conversations that I've been having for the past few months during quarantine, I worked with Maurice to try and come up with some ideas for events that we felt were really relevant to current happenings and what students are asking about on campus. So this is our second of 3 Chai Chats for the term. Our next one is going to be on June 9th with Sydney Ray Chin, who is an intuitive sex educator, and we are going to be talking about utilizing Reiki and energy healing practices to heal from sexual trauma. So I'm really excited about that event. I'm also so excited that Paul is here to talk to us about the new Title IX. When I saw this document released, I was just like, what the heck are we gonna do? And I messaged Maurice immediately and said, we need to have a conversation about this. We just need to break it down. So I am so excited that Paul is here to talk to us, to really put into perspective what these changes are going to mean for Drexel students. And especially as somebody who's about to graduate, this doesn't necessarily apply to me anymore, but I think that this is something that's so important that Drexel students really need to be aware of, and you should be able to understand what resources are available to you. So please feel free to ask candid questions in this time. This is a safe space, and we want you to get the answers that you're looking for. So if you just need anything to be clarified, feel free to throw something in the chat. If you're not comfortable asking the question publicly, you can message me privately and I'll pose the question.
Thank you, Caroline. And Paul, we'll throw it to you.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, Caroline, that's hard to follow. That's extremely inspiring. It's really good to hear all of the work that you're doing and how engaged you are. And I appreciate all of you for coming today and giving me a little bit of time. I actually don't think of this as me giving you time. I think of it as you giving me time, and I'll I'll explain why that is here in a moment. But my name is Paul Apicella. I'm the University's Equal Opportunity and Title IX coordinator. I run the Office of Equality and Diversity, which was in 3225 Arch Street, the James E. Marks Intercultural Center on the ground floor. It's still there, and it'll be there again. It's just there's nobody sitting there right now, as you can imagine. And so we do a lot of work out of the Office of Equality and Diversity. Some of you may be very, very familiar with that. Some of you may not be familiar with it at all. And if you aren't familiar with it at all, that's okay. Don't worry, it won't hurt my feelings. In fact, I actually really like to know when that's the case, because raising awareness is a big part of what I do. In fact, it's one of the biggest challenges that I think we have in our office, and it has to be one of our big priorities. And so when we have people, particularly students or other community members, who aren't aware, not just of our office, but about the issues that we deal with. I'm actually extremely happy to hear that, because it tells me there's an opportunity for us to sort of talk to somebody a little bit more about what we do, and to ask them what we can do to engage them and others who are in similar situations to learn a bit more. So for that reason, I am extremely happy and thankful for this opportunity. I didn't even know that these happened. I thank you, Maurice, for doing the good work of putting these on, including during these trying times. So as I mentioned, with all that aside, as I mentioned, I help run the university's Office of Equality University. We do a lot of things there, right? So everything from receiving reports of behavior that could constitute discrimination or harassment in all of its forms, whether that's race-based, gender-based, religion, ethnicity, veteran status. Really, there are a whole host of categories, right? But basically, we look into any behavior that we think isn't in keeping with the university's commitment to providing a safe and inclusive learning environment and working environment for all of our community members, all right? That sounds very broad, almost so broad that you might struggle to understand exactly what it means. That's also a good thing. And the reason why is because our commitment is very broad. We do have a couple of policies that we administer. I hate talking about policies, even though I was a lawyer in a private life and it's sort of a second language to me. The reason I hate talking about policies are because I think that policies distract us from their real meaning, which are the values that underlie the policies, okay? And so we do have some policies that we work with out of our office that define processes, that define certain terms and things like that. They are important to talk about, and I'll talk about them with you a little bit here today. But I also want you to understand that I and my office, we really work hard to focus on again, some of the values that we talked about that underlie those policies and that underlie the purpose of our office: diversity, inclusion, and again, fostering safe and inclusive learning environments, okay? So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that. As we go along, Maurice mentioned this. Please don't hesitate to shout out if you've got a question. I'm on my phone right now because of where I'm sitting, and so I can't actually see all of you. So if you just raise your hand or wave, it'll be hard for me. Maurice, you might be able to see everybody. So if somebody gives a nonverbal wave or cue, that's fine, but also don't feel free to just start, yelling. It's okay. It's totally okay. I'm not easily scared, so it'll be fine. All right. So a couple of the policies I was talking about, one is our, we call it shorthand, it's OED 1, but really it's a general non-discrimination, non-harassment policy. All right. And that policy deals with behavior that could constitute harassment or discrimination, again, based on a pretty broad range of characteristics like religion, race, gender in some cases, ethnicity, things like that. Okay, I'm happy to talk a bunch about that too. It's extremely, extremely important. And we're actually seeing a huge uptick in reports of conduct that could fall under that policy, right? But I think the primary reason we're here to talk today is about behavior that could fall under a different policy that we administer out of my office, and that's our sexual or gender-based harassment misconduct policy. If I talk about it a bunch, because it's a mouthful, you might hear me refer to it as OED 3. I hope that's not confusing. But again, it's just because sexual and gender-based harassment and misconduct gets to be a lot to say over and over again, okay? But all of that behavior falls under OED 3. There are a variety of behaviors that are defined there. Everything from sexual harassment, which is basically unwanted conduct of a sexual nature. Those could be sexual advances in a workplace, in a social setting, in a classroom setting, right? What you would think of as just sort of persistent unwanted attention of a romantic or a sexual nature, all the way up to allegations of, unfortunately, of what could be called forcible rape, okay? So again, everything from catcalling on the street up to allegations of forcible sexual assaults and rapes are covered under that particular policy. There are behaviors in between, okay? Dating or domestic violence, all right, which is two people involved in a romantic relationship, however they define that. It doesn't have to be that they live together. They don't have to be married or engaged or in a sort of a formal monogamous sort of relationship. Any relationship of sort of a romantic nature, if there's violence that occurs within the context, that might fall under a definition of domestic or intimate partner violence. Stalking, Sexual exploitation, which is, for example, taking pictures or video of somebody in a sexual situation without their consent. All of that falls under our policy. Okay, we do have a zero tolerance policy. So if somebody is found responsible for one of those behaviors at Drexel, let's say it's a student, although it doesn't have to be, it can be a faculty member or a visitor to campus. If they're found responsible for those behaviors, there could be sanctions. For a student, those sanctions could include suspension or expulsion from the university. If it's an employee, they could be terminated from their position, right? Their job they could be let go from their job. If it's a community member, they could be told that they're not allowed on or around campus anymore, right? And some mix of all those things for people if they sort of cross boundaries as far as who they are, okay? So we cover all of that, right? And we deal with that on a daily basis. Unfortunately, we do deal with it on a daily basis. Reports have gone up and up and up and up steadily over the years. We'll see if that holds, and we'll talk about why in a little bit, okay? But that's a big part of what we do. The university has, and if we were in a room, I'd be asking you some questions because I'd want to pick your brain and I'd want to put you on the spot and see what you knew before I gave you the information. Given the format, I'll just tell you a few things. We have processes that are listed in our policy that sort of really lay out how we address reports of sexual misconduct, right, that could fall under the policy, all right? They're very, very detailed. In fact, in some ways, they're almost too detailed to the point where I want them to remain accessible to the people who might need to read and understand them, okay? Whether that's a parent whose student is having an issue, whether that's a student themselves, somebody else, a friend who wants to help a friend, something like that. I'd like to make those as accessible as possible. It's hard to do when we have to lay out so many things, okay? We'll talk about that too, all right? But they're all laid out there. And so everything from resource options. So we have a variety of resource and support options that are available to people if they have experienced an incident of sexual misconduct, all right? And that could be academic accommodations, modifications to class schedules, emergency housing assistance, referrals to free counseling services, okay? All sorts of stuff that we can do. That's really very important. I want to make sure that everybody knows that if they know nothing else, okay? Those resources and support services are available to a person who says they've experienced an incident of sexual misconduct, regardless of whether or not they want to do anything else, okay? So we do not say, and we never will say, look, we'll help you out with your class schedule if you file a formal complaint and you go through an investigation process or you go to the cops or whatever it is. We will never say that to anybody, okay? And in fact, much of the work and much of the time that we spend is done helping people who say, you know what, that process, that's not for me. Okay, but I do need some assistance. I got to get through this term, right? I need to clear my head. I need to figure some things out. I can't afford to drop out. All right. There are a lot of studies out there that show that within the 24 to 48 hours of a sexual assault occurring, people are making some very serious life decisions. And oftentimes they're doing that without support. Okay. So things like not showing up for an exam, not finishing a term paper, not going to class, right? Engaging in drug or alcohol abuse or other sort of high-risk behavior, self-harm, things like that, all right? A lot of that stuff happens within 24 to 48 hours. We want people to know that there's help here for you, okay? If you have an exam on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday, quite frankly, Friday or the next week, and you've experienced the trauma of sexual misconduct and you're not able to study or prepare the way that you would, we can help, okay? We can help you. We can get reasonable course extensions often, okay? We can get incompletes negotiated, things like that, all right? So we are there in many instances to assist, first and foremost, okay? We also let people know about their procedural options, and they are options. We never force anybody to do anything they don't want to do or say anything they don't want to say, okay? But if somebody says, you know what, this person, I want them held accountable through the student code of conduct, through the student conduct system, we are more than happy to process those cases as well, all right? We have a staff of trained individuals in my office who investigate these kinds of reports. They have a lot of experience doing that, of assisting people who've been impacted by incidents of sexual misconduct, okay? And we have a very detailed and thorough investigative process, all right? That's something else that we constantly work on to try and make more accessible, in particular to students, okay? We try to cut down on timelines while also balancing the fact that we have to be thorough. We try to make them understandable. and we do try to be thorough, so that it's not on somebody who's experienced one of these incidents to go out and gather all the evidence and get all the witnesses together and do all those things. We do that, right? We handle that, okay? And we try to do that in a way that's fair and neutral, all right? It's not our job to take sides in the investigative process, all right? I always find that the truth favors detail, okay, and it favors, it becomes apparent when you do a detailed investigation, a neutral investigation. The truth typically becomes apparent in my experience, okay? And so we usher that process along, okay? We interview witnesses, whoever it might be. We gather material, whether that's text messages, social media messages, pictures, video. You'd be surprised at what we see sometimes. Sometimes we see physical evidence, those kinds of things, okay? We'll gather all those things and we'll compile them, we'll put them together, and we'll draft a report, okay? We allow the parties to see that report, both sides, a person who's accused of misconduct and a person who alleges they experienced the misconduct, so that everybody understands what information was gathered. We try to, again, be as transparent and fair as possible, all right? And then there are other steps to the process if it's decided that they go forward, for example, through a student conduct, through sort of a student conduct hearing process that can result in sanctions for a person who's found responsible, okay? So that's a mouthful, and I know, and I apologize for talking so much at you. But it's important for you all to understand that there is a lot that goes into it. Again, we devote a lot of time and energy to it. It's something I think there's a lot of misconception and misunderstanding about. But it's also something that we constantly work on, right? Where there are those misconceptions or those misunderstandings, I think that's our responsibility to get better at that, right? To get better at communicating and to get better at letting our students and others know what's out there for them, what these issues are, and what to do if they or someone that they know needs some help, okay? And so that's a big piece of what I wanted to talk about, is related to the process piece. But just as important, and sometimes in some ways I think more important, are two other sort of facets of what we do, and that's education and engagement, okay? So my office is also responsible for making sure that we do programming, educational programming, outreach, and community engagement on these issues, again, so that we can raise awareness and let people know about the resources and support that are available to them through the university or in the community. So those educational programs, quite frankly, are a huge challenge. And I would love to hear from any or all of you today who have any thoughts about any of this stuff, because student engagement in particular is really a moving target all of the time. I have to constantly try to figure out what are the best ways to make students aware and to get them involved. And so if you have any thoughts on that as we go along, I'd love to hear about them. There are some mechanisms that we have now. We have a website, although to me, a website feels a little bit outdated because I'm not so sure that that's the primary way that people are gonna reach and access information, okay? But we do have a website. We're also stepping up social media, our social media presence through Instagram accounts and things like that to try and raise our profile a little bit. We also do programming. So Sexual Violence Awareness Month just concluded. This was by far the weirdest sexual assault awareness month I've ever been through because it was all virtual. And so we did a virtual Take Back the Night. We did a variety of other virtual programming, things like that. We do programming during Welcome Week and orientation. We do trainings for faculty and staff about what to do if a student discloses to them that they have experienced or been accused of sexual misconduct. We do training with Res Life staff about these issues, about reporting obligations, about how to recognize these issues, about how to respond to them in the moment, okay? And we are always, again, looking to engage students, but also, again, some of these other folks around the university so that they understand what's going on and know how to direct somebody towards help if somebody comes forward. So that's a huge piece. With that, again, I've talked a lot. Does anybody have any questions or comments about that piece, about the stuff that I shared so far?
Question on that last point.
Yeah.
What kind of resources, or I guess training, if there is, provided to professors and other faculty and like administrative staff so that they're aware of what kind of processes need to be done? Yeah.
So there it happens in a couple of ways, and again, prevention and program is something that I really focus on and study, and I am constantly trying to hone and recalibrate what we're doing. I think of education and prevention like a platform, right? Where we have different planks in the platform, but there's no one plank that's really going to be the whole thing, right? And so we have to try and attack these issues again from the faculty and professional staff, or from the student side, from a few different angles. One is every employee, professors, admin staff, everybody takes an annual training that is really designed to be relatively basic. It's called Understanding Title IX. That's about issues of sexual misconduct. It talks to them or tells them about our policy. It tells them about their obligation to report issues that they become aware of. And it tells them what our office does. All right. And there are some basics in there about how to respond, to a disclosure, what kind of resources and support we offer, right? Things like that. All right. So that's sort of the basic stuff. I also do targeted in-person trainings pretty darn frequently, where I go into department head meetings, I go into faculty and staff meetings. I send out emails. We have newsletters that go out. We're part of the HR newsletter. We have an OED newsletter that goes out. The in-person trainings, though, again, we go in there for face-to-face targeted trainings on workshops on how to respond to disclosures, workshops on how to recognize issues, when a student may be experiencing issues, the code language that people, not just students, that people use sometimes when they've experienced an incident that they're humiliated or that they're not comfortable talking about, but they need assistance. Okay. We talk about how to ask some basic questions that aren't pressing, but that lets you know if you need to help that student find some additional assistance. Okay. So those are really sort of main areas of communication right now. With the new regulations coming out that we're going to talk about here in a minute, we're going to have to rethink that and step that up all over again to communicate again about this stuff and about what we're doing. So I hope that answers your question. If you have any other thoughts or any other questions, I'd love to hear that as well.
I was actually curious, how is the way that your office is responding and I guess your job as well, changing with the new regulations?
Yeah, wow, that's a fantastic question, actually, and a hard one. Maurice, you told me there would be no hard questions, man. I'm just kidding. That's great, though. I do appreciate it. So the quick answer to that is we're not sure in some ways. Okay, there are fundamental ways in which we are sure. So our values haven't changed, right? So we're still going to have a zero tolerance policy to sexual misconduct in our community, okay, and amongst our community members. We're still going to respond with a process that is fair, as timely as we can possibly make it, but it's also sensitive to the human issues that are involved. One of our core tenets is always going to be to provide resources and support, okay? First and foremost, again, without strings attached, without conditions, or without qualifications. Those things are not going to change, okay? Quite frankly, what is going to change are some of the procedural hurdles that we are required to jump over, some of the ways in which we are required to communicate with our community members, sometimes in good ways and sometimes in bad, in terms of what kind of notices we're required to give, what kind of timelines we're required to have, right? There are a lot of really kind of crazy timelines that are involved in here, and the kinds of things we're going to have to allow people to do as part of our process, all right? Some of it is a little bit hard for me, again, on a personal level, it's a little hard for me to sort of stomach, okay? But we also don't have a ton of wiggle room on that, okay? So there's procedural stuff. There are adjustments that we're going to have to make as far as what our investigations look like and those sorts of things, what we allow people to do. And I'll fill in some of the details on that here in a bit. But what the big thing that I think it emphasizes for us is we have to get even better at the support piece, right? We have to get even better at the engagement piece, right? We have to really make sure that we're taking care of people who've experienced these incidents, and that we let people know that we're here for support too. That when they come in, that they're not going to get into something they didn't sign up for, right? We're not going to call the police if they don't want us to. We're not calling anybody's parents if they don't want us to. We're not going to make them testify with a capital T, right? We're not going to do any of those things. But the first thing we're going to do is ask if they're okay and ask if there's anything we can do to help. All right. So that's not going to change. The procedural piece is going to change. How we have to look at and receive these things might change, okay? And how we communicate that might change. But again, I think it sort of emphasizes the importance of the culture piece. What the government has said is, they've said, we're not going to solve this for you. Not that they ever were going to solve it, but now they basically said, we really don't want any part of this, okay? And what that means is we've got to help ourselves, right? We've got to look at our culture, and we've got to look at how we engage our community, and we've got to work on those pieces that we can control so that we never have to engage in that, in what might look like a pretty unfriendly process. So I appreciate that. That was a hard question. I tried to answer it the best I could.
I just want to just kind of make a little bit of a statement there. Paul, maybe you can kind of explain that after what you just said, that doesn't mean that we won't eventually involve a legal system if that's the next steps that need to be taken or should be taken. Because I think sometimes people think that with the new changes, that it kind of comes completely out of the hands of law enforcement, where it's more in the hands of the university. But can you just talk about that a little bit, how the law enforcement piece is still a part of it when it happens?
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic point. I often harp on this. I say, we're not going to call the police, right? We're not going to do this. And I often say that because for a lot of people that experience these kinds of things, it can be a life-changing event, right? And there's a lot going on, right? And so going to the police or going to law enforcement for some folks is extremely intimidating, and it's not what they want to do, okay? And so for that reason, I try to help people understand the distinction, right? That we aren't law enforcement, and we're not going to make you do that, okay? But the truth is that if or when people decide that a law enforcement process is what they want to do, I'm more than happy to coordinate with law enforcement and to help them get to law enforcement, or to help law enforcement come to them so that we can work on the issue together where we can and where it's appropriate. That's just not a connection that we're going to force, okay? But a lot of times I talk to somebody, my personal feelings might be like, oh man, I know this was a crime, you know, and like, I really, as a person, as a human being, it makes me very, very uncomfortable to know that somebody is out there doing these things and might not be held accountable. But I also respect people's agency, and I also respect that that's not my decision, right? That's not a decision for me to make. That's a decision for this person who had this experience to make. I'm always going to respect that, always going to respect it. But we do work very, very closely with the police when the time comes for that. We communicate closely with the police when the time comes for that, whether that's Drexel Police or Philadelphia Police. The city of Philadelphia has a sexual violence center. They call it a special victims unit, where they do things like medical examinations and medical treatment for individuals who've recently experienced rape, okay, or sexual assault. All right. We help students get in touch with the special victims unit or get to the special victims unit if that's what that student wants to do. All right. Sometimes that can be extremely helpful for particularly early on, because even if the student isn't sure about what they want to do, it helps preserve evidence. It helps document issues early on, so that later, if that person decides that they do want to explore a criminal route, right, a law enforcement route, that option is open to them. Sometimes, unfortunately, if a student doesn't engage in that process early on, it becomes much, much harder from a law enforcement perspective to move through the process, because they haven't preserved or collected the kind of evidence that they typically need in those cases. So we can certainly help with that as well. All right. So I appreciate that, but we also never discourage somebody from law enforcement from going to law enforcement, and that's part of a conversation we have, is to let them know about that option and to ask them if that's something they'd like to do. Yeah, I appreciate that question. Thank you, Maurice.
We have another question. I'm a little confused on the new Title IX. Does Title IX now allow resources for victims of sexual harassment, or are they narrowing down who Title IX is for?
Oh, great question. That's a great segue into the next piece. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer that question first. And then if we don't have other questions, I'll sort of move in very quickly into sort of a little bit of a high-level review about what's in the new regulations, some of the stuff that might change, and then I think what the plan is looking like for what we're working on to work those new regulations into what we do on a daily basis. All right. So the question is whether the new Title IX regulations allow for somebody who's been a victim of sexual harassment to receive resources and support services, or whether they narrow that down to exclude those folks. The answer to that question is that the regulations do allow, and in fact often require, people who've experienced sexual harassment, not necessarily sexual assault, but sexual harassment. They do allow for and often require those individuals to be provided with resources and support measures. I can tell you this, even if they did not, we would do it anyway, right? And so that's a big piece of the new regulatory framework. It's important to understand what regulations are, right? So regulations are put out by a government agency that's tasked with enforcing a particular federal law. So they have the force of law, but they aren't the law themselves, okay? They also do, in this context in particular, they establish what is kind of a, in some cases, a minimum bar that we have to meet in a variety of areas, but they don't say that we can't do more, that we can't provide more resources, that we can't provide more support or more protection in a lot of areas, okay? And so even if they said, well, you know, you don't really have to provide victims of sexual harassment specifically with resources, I can tell you right now, that's a value-based decision that we're gonna make no matter what, okay? And that would come in a variety of areas, so. All right. Any other questions before I move into the regs? I could talk about this stuff all day, so I'm happy to segue or do whatever. Okay. All right. So related to the new regulations, okay, as many of you, some or many of you may have heard, the Department of Education did issue new regulations a couple of weeks ago that cover what they call Title IX. They narrow it down to Title IX, right? Title IX is a federal law that bars or prohibits, among other things, discrimination on the basis of sex or gender in educational settings from any institution that receives federal funding, okay? That's basically every college or university, including Drexel, even though it's private, okay? Drexel still receives federal funds, it's still involved in federal programs, federal tuition assistance, things like that, financial aid, all that sort of stuff. And so Title IX applies to Drexel as well, all right? It used to be that people mostly thought of Title IX applying to athletics, right? Equal participation opportunities for male and female student athletes. It does apply to that, and that's certainly a very laudable and prominent part of what Title IX does and has done over the years. But over time, there's come to be a more fulsome understanding that these issues of sexual misconduct on and around college campuses, they do create issues and barriers to access, and they are based upon sex or gender in their individual instance, and in the aggregate, they create environmental issues, okay, for people of various genders or sexes. And so for that reason, they also can create issues under Title IX, all right? One of the ways the government has recognized they create issues under Title IX are in areas of sexual misconduct, which are what we've been talking about, okay? And so therefore, it has been for some time now that if the university becomes aware of an incident of sexual misconduct, and that impacts a person's educational opportunities, we have an obligation to take reasonable steps to minimize the impact on that person's educational opportunities, right? Whether that's through providing resources or support, or whether that's through holding a person accountable for alleged misconduct so that they can't continue to victimize people in the community, okay? That's our obligation. Again, that's a legal obligation, but I also think it's a moral obligation, and it's one that I take very seriously and that we take very seriously, all right? So in 2011, the Obama administration put out guidance related to sexual misconduct and said, by the way, schools, people have been ignoring this for a long time, but we're not going to ignore this anymore. We're going to enforce these obligations, and we are going to be coming after schools that are essentially turning a blind eye towards issues of sexual misconduct. A lot of what was happening was schools were saying, listen, these are really difficult issues and we don't know what to deal with them. So why don't we just let the cops deal with them, right? And if the police don't think that they can deal with it, then who are we to say, right? Well, what was happening was most people didn't want to engage in the law enforcement process, and people who do want to engage in the law enforcement process it's not always the easiest to navigate, right? Something like 95% of rape allegations don't get prosecuted, okay? And the reason why is because it's very difficult to convince a jury about something that happens usually between two people, usually without a whole lot of witnesses, okay? At least usually not a whole lot of direct witnesses to the actual act itself, okay? Those are very hard cases for lawyers to win. And unfortunately, sometimes that reverse engineers a process where police are very skeptical of these claims when they're made, and they're not willing to investigate them fully or to prosecute them fully, all right? It's a very difficult system. So what was happening was, because there's a high concentration of young adults who are drinking alcohol and using drugs and in different social environments, without a lot of adult supervision and all that sort of stuff, they were sort of seen as high frequency areas of sexual misconduct, okay? Well, what that was doing was that was impacting the educational environment, right? And so for example, a lot of the ways that it was looked at was primarily with women. They were saying, listen, something like 40%, anywhere between 40 and 80% of young women report that they experience some form of sexual misconduct while they're in college. Okay, that's high, and what that does is that creates an environmental issue, right? And so I think rightfully so, the Department of Education said, look, you all are creating an unequal, or you're allowing an unequal educational environment to exist because you're not willing to address these issues culturally or in individual instances, okay? So they started to regulate it, and the Obama administration put out guidance about how we have to do this. It was a sea change. It required investigations. It required support services. It required a whole bunch of stuff. It took a long time for schools to wrap their head around what was going on and to try and get on board and build out offices and staff and things like that to deal with these issues the way that, quite frankly, they should have been dealing with them, okay? Just when a lot of places felt like they were catching their breath, we have a new administration in now. What ends up happening is the new administration, and I hate to give a civics lesson, I hope I'm not putting anyone to sleep, but the new administration oversees the Department of Education. And the new administration tells the Department of Education what to do, and tells the Department of Education, do this, don't do that, put out new regs, don't put out new regs, rescind this guidance or put out this guidance. The Trump administration, quite frankly, has taken a pretty hostile stance toward the reporting and processing of allegations of sexual misconduct in universities. That's me putting it kind of nicely. Again, regardless of your political slant or your political orientation, they have looked very, very skeptically on universities' abilities to deal with issues of sexual misconduct involving their own community members, okay? So this has been coming for a long time, where they felt that the Obama administration had overreached and had created an uneven playing field that was slanted substantially against people who are accused of misconduct. And they felt that it created an environment where people who are accused of sexual misconduct were not being given a fair shake, okay? And so the Trump administration has long said, we need to fix that. And we need to fix that by changing the process and putting much stricter requirements and different requirements on schools and how we deal with these issues, okay? And so that's where they've gone, all right? A lot of stuff. Somebody asked about the definition, about who's entitled to support measures. One of the things they've done is they've really narrowed a lot of the definitions related to sexual misconduct. Before, the Obama administration told us Title IX applies to conduct, for example, no matter where it occurs, okay? It could happen study abroad. It could happen on spring break in another country. It could happen between, for example, two students who are vacationing together over the summer in Europe or in Asia or wherever. It doesn't matter where it happens. It could be not on campus, but it could be in an off-campus apartment. And they said if it's between people where the person who experienced that misconduct is having their educational environment impacted. So it's not about where it happens, it's about where the effect reaches. If that effect comes back to campus, for example, two people who, again, were involved in an incident in Mexico on spring break are now, they're in the same major, they're in the same class when they come back from spring break, okay? The Obama administration was very clear and said Title IX applies, okay? The university has to deal with that. The Trump administration has gone in the complete opposite direction they have redefined they call it a clarification, but they've redefined from the previous approach where the geographic scope is. They have now told us if it doesn't happen on campus in a university controlled setting and involving a person over whom the university has substantial control, then it doesn't fall under Title IX and the university can't process it through its regular Title IX processes. That's very important because, again, even if it's in a study abroad context, let's say a study abroad program in Spain, 2 students, we now have to find a different way to address that behavior, okay? They also changed the definition of what constitutes, for example, sexual harassment, all right? Before, the Obama administration said sexual harassment, it's a boring legal definition, severe or pervasive, right, or objectively hostile such that it substantially impacts a person's access to their educational opportunities, okay? That's a mouthful. I read it fast because I don't need you to memorize it, okay? This administration has changed it to say it has to be severe and pervasive, okay? That's a big, big change. It seems like it's only little. It's only changing or to and. The reason it's a big, big change is because a lot of the stuff that we're talking about sort of unwanted sexual advances, right? That make a person feel, for example, like I can't go to, I don't want to go to class. I don't want to go back to my room in the residence hall because I don't feel comfortable there. A lot of that kind of behavior gets harder for us to address in a quick way and an easy way under our policies. All right, that is going to be a big shift. It raises the bar. Okay, it really raises the bar. Okay, so there are definitional ways it changes what we can or what we have to do. It also changes our process. So it imposes, the new regulations impose a variety of new requirements for us in how we investigate and how we process complaints or reports, okay? Now, for example, under the Obama administration, they were very clear. The university cannot require somebody to put their allegations in writing in order to put the university on notice so that it has to deal with that. It has to process that report. This administration has very clearly said, in order to investigate, the university has to have a formal complaint. A formal complaint is a signed statement in writing, okay? Somebody has to put it in writing and has to sign it, okay? We also have to provide a certain kind of notice, all right? That to me is big, right? Because again, they seem like subtle shifts that really raise the threshold. They raise the obstacles to people who are in pretty vulnerable situations sometimes to accessing the kind of process that they want and that they may be entitled to, okay? So changes process stuff. It also changes, again, how we do our investigations. Our investigations, quite frankly, and I freely admit this, maybe you have heard about this from others, or maybe it's just a common knowledge, they take too long. And that's very unfortunate. We try to be as quick as possible, but we have to balance that with being thorough. The new regulations have now said we have to add 10 days here, we have to add 10 days there for this and that to provide notice, and so now it's going to be hard to understand how we're going to keep our timelines shorter, okay? Which is something we were focusing a lot on, okay? It also changes how we have to run hearings, for example. It used to be that people can attend hearings in person, they can attend them virtually, they don't have to be in the same room, that kind of thing. That if people wanted to ask questions of each other, we wouldn't allow direct cross-examination, right? If you've seen too many movies or TV shows, you've seen a lawyer and a witness on a stand sort of going at each other, and there's the aha, the gotcha moment kind of thing, okay? They said you can't do that because it's not an appropriate context, right? It's not appropriate to put someone, for example, who's experienced such a traumatic incident, to have them be directly cross-examined in a student conduct hearing, okay? The new regulations have said, guess what? You have to allow direct cross-examination. Now, you don't allow the two, for example, let's say they're two students. You don't allow two students to directly cross-examine each other, but you have to allow each of them to have an advisor that cross-examines the other party, okay? That's a big, big change. And not only that, but what they've said if a person doesn't come to the hearing and submit to cross-examination, if they don't answer or participate in the cross-examination piece, the university cannot use any information that they provided in making a decision in that case. All right. That's really big. That's really, really big. Because what it means is, for example, if a person comes to me, and again, I'm sort of thinking in crazy hypotheticals here, but if a person reports a sexual assault and comes in and gives, heaven forbid, a video of that incident, or a text message of somebody admitting it and saying, I'm sorry, and then they go through the process, and for whatever reason, they don't come to the hearing to be cross-examined, if we don't have that video or that message or that information from someplace else, we can't use it, even though it may directly show what it was that happened. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, we cannot use it. And the government has been very, very clear on that, okay? That's a very difficult position to be in. Go ahead, Caroline. I see you've got at least one thought.
Yeah, I'm just curious because you introduced this conversation by saying that you don't really like to talk about policies because it's more about the values that are underlying. So what do you think the benefit of having that change in this policy, like who does that help, is immediately where my mind goes. So like that just seems like so anti-victim that I don't know how it helps the other people in the situation.
Yeah. So I'm trying to be thoughtful about how I answer this. I think that a really quick way to answer that is to say, I agree with you, and I have many of the same questions, right? So one of the difficult positions that we are in, quite frankly, right now as a university, is that there are places where we can use our discretion and make value-based decisions, right? One of them is that we were talking about related to, again, who we provide resources and support to. I'm not changing that, right? But there are places where the department and the government have come out and very clearly and directly said, you must do X, you cannot do Y. That is a place where we don't have discretion to make a value, regardless of what our values are. We don't have discretion there. And making decisions that ignore those mandates, they also don't serve anybody, because what ended up happening is, for example, if I said, for example, look, I don't care what they say, we're not allowing cross-examination at hearings. The only thing that's going to happen there is somebody is going to turn around and they're going to get that decision overturned very, very quickly. They're going to be right back, and we're actually probably going to lose an opportunity to hold them accountable in any way at that point, right?
So,
go ahead.
Good question. So with that and with all the other changes, what resources then does OED have to protect and support the individuals who aren't going to be protected under these changes?
Yeah, so it depends on what you mean by protect.
I mean, provide guidance to, provide support, as we were saying before, those sorts of things.
Yeah. So we still will have and always will make available what we call support advisors, can be available to the people who are involved in our process. They don't have to be somebody that we provide, although we are happy to provide support advisors to the people involved in our process. Quite frankly, it can be anybody, okay? It can be somebody's best friend, as long as they're not a witness or a potential witness in any process. It can be a parent. It can be a relative, it can be a professor, it can be a clergy member, it can be anybody that they want. They're allowed to have those people with them at any point in the process, any meeting, any discussion, any conversation, any phone call, anything at all. They're allowed to have those people present to provide them with support. We also spend a lot of time talking about processes and support services, resources and support services. If we need to do community referrals to community agencies like Women Against Abuse or Women Organized Against Rape, religious and spiritual life, counseling, right? All these sorts of things. We constantly are pressing those to all of the people who are involved in our process. Quite frankly, even people who are accused of sexual misconduct, we also make advisors available to them through the process. They are also allowed to have their own advisors present if they would like. So those things don't change. We also have, under the law, but also again, under our values and our policy, we have protections against retaliation, right? So a lot of these issues sometimes involve people who know each other, who are in similar social circles, part of similar organizations, whether those are student organizations or others, things like that. And so if people have concerns about retaliation, we do also have processes and mechanisms for addressing retaliation. It's a separate offense. We take it very, very seriously. Sometimes it can be very, very serious. And so we'll address those as well. And we inform people and let people know about those all along the way. We assign to their case a case manager who is responsible for reaching out to them, checking in with them, making sure that they're okay. If they have any questions, that's the point person they can reach out to at any point along the way so that we can quickly intervene, right? So we do have a lot of those mechanisms in place, including, again, even when if we go to the hearing piece and you say, oh my gosh, somebody can hire an attorney and have them come in there and cross-examine this person who experienced this event. So unfortunately, it looks like that's likely going to be true here in the near future, okay? But again, we're also looking at ways to provide somewhat of an equitable and equally trained advisor for the other party as well, okay? So that person, again, can provide them with some advice, can help them prepare, can do some of those things as well, all right? So those are all things that we're looking at. I hope that was helpful. Yeah.
I have a question about how this information is being given to students. And this is kind of a question for everybody because maybe, we could have a brainstorming session. But I don't know if I've seen a lot of literature put out by Drexel about the new Title IX and specifically what that means for students going forward. And I think that the university does with all the policies that you just mentioned, a fairly good job of, protecting students once the incident happens. But I don't know if a lot of students know about the specific policies that are now being made because of the new Title IX. So
Yeah.
if that makes any sense. Like,
No, absolutely.
what is the university doing specifically to get that literature out?
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic question, and I am gonna tell you sort of my synopsis or my understanding of some of the things that we do, but I want to tell you at the outset that it's not good enough. What we do is not good enough. And I actually just started full time as a Title IX coordinator here in March. I was here on a temporary basis starting in October. But my top priority is working on the communication, the engagement piece. I bet if I went around campus and I stopped students on and around campus, at least 9 out of 10 would not know what in the heck I'm talking about when I talk about this stuff. They wouldn't know they wouldn't know. They just wouldn't know. And that's not their fault. That's our fault. If there is fault to be, if you want to make it turn into a blame game, right? But it's certainly our responsibility, right? And so we've got to find ways to get this out. It's also kind of hard. So again, I talked about that platform piece. So one of the primary mechanisms that we have are all incoming students, we have them take a mandatory sexual violence module, right? You may have taken it when you came here. You may remember maybe that you took it, but you don't remember anything that was said in that module. That actually, I think, is really normal. And that's why it can't be the only thing that we do. But what that's designed to do is give people an initial hit of information when they come in, so that later, if for some reason they need to use, whether they've experienced something themselves or somebody they know has, they say, wait a minute, I remember where the website was, or I remember, wait a minute, that's a problem and there's someplace I can go, I can Google it, okay? If that's all that people remember, then that's a big win, right? Because remember, like I said, that 24 to 48 hour window is really important. So if people don't know what to do or what options they've got, that time's ticking, okay? So we have this initial thing where we talk about what sexual misconduct is, the different definitions, right? What it looks like, what our policies are, what the Office of Equality and Diversity is, what resources and support are available, where they can go, all right? And hopefully that carries over. We do the Welcome Week programming, again, sort of during the orientation type process. We have our Res Life staff bring it up during floor meetings for students who are living in Res Life spaces, right, in residence halls. Outside of that, there's Sexual Assault Awareness Month in April, where we try to do programming and raise the profile. And there's Domestic Violence Awareness Month in October, where we try to do a similar slate of programming around issues of domestic violence. We have a website, and we try to get in front of student groups and student organizations where we can. We try to work with Greek Life where we can, things like that. To me, there's a big gap there, right? There's a big gap, because we have what's called a life cycle of the student. We can't expect students, one, to memorize the stuff that they see in a online training when they've got 50 other things going on and when they first come in the door during their first year, right? They've forgotten that, okay? We need to find other ways to communicate with them. There's also, quite frankly, what they call a second red zone, right? Red zone typically refers to a high risk period of time for sexual violence around the first month, the first 30 days of a new academic year, or really the first 30 days of a term. There's a new red zone when students typically turn 21, because now they're out in new social environments, legally drinking alcohol in different settings and things like that. There's a whole different risk profile that goes with that. So we see a big bump then too, okay? We don't have, quite frankly, a robust education and programming curriculum around all of these issues. So I don't always know how to engage students and raise awareness, right? We have a website that, believe me, we spend way too much time on the website stuff, but like students don't really go to websites that much in that way anymore. And that kind of communication isn't affirmative enough. So that's why we're working on raising social media platform, profiles and things like that. But I'm actually very interested in hearing if you have any ideas, or if anybody else has any ideas for anything else that we could do, anyone else we can work with to try and start getting out there and building some of these lines of communication up to raise awareness.
I'm gonna make 2 quick points too about that. Is I think that for me, since I started at Drexel, 2 things are really, really true when it comes to just the idea of trust. I think that administrators like ourselves have to hold other administrators accountable when they aren't doing a good enough job, and when they aren't speaking to our students in the correct way, and when they aren't really given the time of day that they deserve. And I even tell my students all the time, you can always hold me accountable. Like, I think that students do a great job of telling us where the gaps are, but I think sometimes it just goes to a department as opposed to direct individuals where they can really be held accountable and they can look at themselves and be like, I didn't do this well enough. Like, I've worked with OED since I started here, and I've given a lot of reports as a mandatory reporter and things like that. And students constantly come back to me and just talk to me just in general about like how their day is going and what's going on with that. And I really take that solace and I try to push it forward. But just like you said, Paul, like, we honestly don't think that at Drexel we've done a great enough job at that, especially in the past. There was people who were in similar seats of you who weren't front facing at all. So unless you actually went through a traumatic situation, you would never see like a Paul. And I think now things are starting to shift and people really want to be in front of people and just talk like this. Like, even the fact that you're here tonight, given this conversation, I don't think it would have necessarily happened 3 years ago. Right. I think that we are trying to shift it, but I think that we got to hold our counterparts accessible and hold them up to the fire as well. And I think that students keep coming to us and telling us where we are, where the pitfalls are, and we just have to be better as a whole. So I just wanted to make those 2 points as well.
I think also trust takes time. I know from conversations I've had with students, as a student and then also as someone who works for the SCDI, that people don't always trust admin, especially different offices, that it takes a lot of time and a lot of being willing to be in front of students and say, I don't know, and what do you need? It takes more than one meeting. It takes sometimes years.
Yeah, I agree. I 100% agree with that. And not only that, but particularly in this context at a university, the job is never done, because every year your community changes every single year because you have people coming in and going out. We can never stop. We can never think, oh, you know what? We've done enough engagement. Now we're done. Because we're not done. We're never done. And we have to understand that. And so that piece, that figuring out how to be more forward facing, how to build out some of those channels or some of those mechanisms on an ongoing, more robust basis when they weren't there before, like you were talking about, Maurice. There's been, that's a shift in perspective. And Zach, like you were saying, like you're right. We can't just do it this month. We can't do it for April, and we can't do it for October and think that then we're done for the year. We're not done. And so getting in front of USGA, coming here to these kinds of things, I mean, this is the stuff that I like to do, and that's really, really important. So I'd love to hear about all of those opportunities that you all as students, places we might be present, places where we might have materials present, ways that we might have materials accessible through things that aren't just like necessarily a website, you know, things like that. I'm always looking for more insight on.
I just found a great resource that I mentioned to Paula Maurice in the beginning of the conversation before other people joined, but I found out about the changes in the Title IX document through this organization called Know Your Nine. They have an amazing platform. I followed them on Instagram, and they share some of like really incredible resources, really just laying out like exactly how to go about tackling these issues, what kind of people you should be reaching out to, what kind of questions you should be asking. And they just announced this afternoon that they have this like hands-off Title IX summer intensive program. And you can apply. There's 3 different intensives, and I guess it's just one day, and you'll be learning like more about the rule, how it will impact survivors, and what you can do to take action. You will also gain hard skills on organizing tactics, media and messaging, policy, digital organizing, and escalation tactics. So I think that would be an amazing opportunity if anybody maybe like was supposed to be on co-op right now and doesn't have one, or you have a little time because you're at home. I think this is a great way to spend your time. And even though I'm not going to be on a college campus anymore, I would like to do one of these just so I can understand what it looks like to be on that side of policy making. And I think when Paul was talking about the legality and the complex language involved in policies, I think that that's such a big barrier to people. And I feel that's something that we talked about in our last Chai Chat when Alex was talking about self-advocacy in healthcare, was like, how do you speak that language? Because you might know exactly what you're trying to say, and you could get what you want out of a conversation. You just have to know how to speak that language. So I think that this seems like an amazing resource to help teach you some of those tools so that you're communicating in a way that administrators are really going to be able to hear you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the conference actually has any price associated with it, but anytime something like this comes up, and if there is a price associated with it, you can always reach out to me, and we'll pretty much find a way, exhaust every resource to try to pay people's ways into actually attending certain things like this. So I haven't double checked on the information because Caroline did it right before this meeting. If there is a price associated with any of their resources, but you want to actually be able to partake in them, always reach out to me. Don't let a dollar figure be a reason why you can't gain access to something, because we'll find a way. And if we can't find a way, we'll work really, really hard to get as close as possible. And we typically do find a way at the end of the day.
That's great.
This is free. But I'm glad you said that, because I didn't even think of that before, like reaching out to you guys to help finance things.
Yeah, we do a lot of stuff behind the scenes. We don't always say it a lot, but like our inclusion grants, we do a whole lot of things where we help just like get that bump across where people can access things, because too often with things like this and training and resources, people just don't even look at them because they're like, well, I don't have even $50, you know? So I don't ever want that to be a reason why people can't access information or access some type of training. So just keep that in mind for any inclusion initiative or diversity work. Always reach out to me, and we'll try to make some things work on our end.
And also, if this is just an example of one program that's putting out resources on this topic, but if there's anything that catches your eye that you would love to share with other people or have be a part of something at Drexel, send it our way. Either send it to Maurice or send it to myself. I would be happy to try and work with somebody to create another event or have a different conversation. So I think if there are resources out there that you're familiar with that we haven't talked about, feel free to send them, even if you find them after this particular conversation. I think that would be so worthwhile.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Really quickly, going back to like the previous conversation about ideas on how to get Title IX like more awareness in terms of the changes that are going on. Know Your Title IX, like Caroline said, it has been doing a great job on like awareness on social media and stuff. But I feel like still students, even when they read that, they're confused. Like I've had talks with like some of my like friends, and they're like, well, I don't understand why this is a bad thing that is happening. Or like they, even like when I post those, like they're like, I don't understand why like that's gonna be bad. Like anyways. So I feel like in terms of reaching out and providing more information directly from Drexel, it'd be great to even just see like an email like specifying like these are the things that are changing in Title IX, and this is what Drexel is specifically doing about it.
Yep.
Another great thing that I have a lot of friends in USGA, and that's like, you know, the undergraduate student government, and they've been gaining a lot more popularity among the students and a lot more trust, because obviously they're supposed to be representing the students. So if you found a way to start working with them, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think I've noticed that as well. USGA has again, now my perspective on this is pretty short-lived, like I said, because I only really started here on a temporary basis in October and then permanently in March. But I've noticed what seems to be a strengthening profile from USGA. And so we are working on getting in front of them. I have a draft of a communication going out in Drexel now, and perhaps a blast out to the larger university community that talks some about the regs, less about substance, because one of the other things I forgot to mention that I want to let you know, just so you sort of understand some of the other things that we're looking at here. The regulations that were published, it was over 2,000 pages worth of material, right? So when you include commentary that talks about how to implement the regulations, what the regulations say, what the impact is, what, you know, that sort of stuff, it was 2,033 pages, all right? Usually when a government agency issues new regulations like this, like a comprehensive regulatory scheme, they usually allow at least a calendar year for them to be implemented. This administration said these have to go in effect by August 14th of this year. All right. So 90 days. And that's almost unheard of. And if you're cynical about it, again, regardless of what political orientation you have, if you're cynical about it, you say it's because there's an election in November and they know that the new academic year starts in August. So if they don't make us implement them before August, they really can't realistically make anybody implement them until the beginning of next academic year. That's after November. And if they don't win the election in November, they're going to lose the regulations. They're never going to go into effect. And that wasn't something they wanted to do. So what that means is we are faced with really comprehensive and complicated regulatory change that we have to implement within 90 days, retrain people on, recommunicate on, train new advisors, all sorts of stuff that we have to do within 90 days. It's a tall task. It's also an opportunity, like I said, just to start looking at some of this stuff with fresh eyes, right? That engagement piece, the email that goes out, the initial email that you're probably going to see is saying, hey, there are these new regs. They make a lot of changes. Here's the plan. We are looking at all of the changes. We're assessing them. I have already started a working group of key administrators and decision makers to work on implementing these changes. That group is broken up into subgroups that focus on different areas. One is policy and overarching policy, like changes in definitions, changing in that kind of thing, changes in scope of the policy, that stuff. Process, which say, okay, what are our processes for moving, student reports forward, right? Employee reports. Okay, so there's policy, there's process, there's communication, and then there's the police and public safety piece. All right, the communication piece is about how we communicate with our community members about, again, what the plan is. We have to have internal deadlines, so we have to have the policies and the process done relatively early on so that we can finish the training material and get people trained in time to implement it on August 14th, right? That's when the stuff has to go in effect. So in essence, we actually have a lot of stuff that we have to get done within 30 days, within 45 days, and almost everything within 60 days, because we need 30 days to train and do a bunch of other stuff. So I want to communicate with you all and with everybody else in the community about that piece. It's going to be a very big ordeal. But I don't want to get so caught up in that piece of it that we don't seek input or we don't get feedback from the people that matter most, which are our community members, our students, the people who are going to be impacted by these policies and these procedures. We can't lose sight of the fact that, right, that the most important thing here is that our processes, yes, they're compliant, but that they're accessible. It doesn't matter if they're compliant if people don't know about them or if they're not friendly enough to the people issues that are involved. So you'll see that communication from us relatively soon. I hope you'll be patient if it's, again, a little ambiguous and short on details, because I think a big piece of this is going to be figuring out exactly what those deliverables and what those hard timelines are. We will release more information then in the near future about intermediate progress, right? So here's where we are. We've got this policy approved or this process approved on an interim basis. We're now moving into a training phase. So you should see those communications from us on an ongoing basis.
With that task force, is it primarily administration, or are there also students and faculty on it? I know sometimes it can be helpful to have perspectives of people who are living directly in the situation.
Yeah, so I agree with that 100%. And what we may have to do because of the timelines is we may have to phase things in. So we have to get, like, there are things that we absolutely have to get done without any exception within a certain time frame. What we are likely going to do is, right now we have not had a lot of student engagement on that piece. We will likely, for example, once the processes are drafted, we will have student engagement at that point to review and give feedback. After August 14th, once things get implemented, we are likely going to form a new group that is an assessment and re-implementation group that says, okay, over the next calendar year, what we're going to do is we're going to see how the dust settles, right? Let's reevaluate and reassess how these processes and how these policies are working and give ourselves permission to make the necessary changes within a calendar year by, right, having more time to much more robustly involve students, faculty, staff, experts, things like that. Some of the things we just don't have enough days to do right now.
I had a question that's kind of a different direction, but I used to be a member of FSL, and I was involved in a sorority, and I wasn't happy with the way that FSL handled a lot of situations regarding Title IX policies, and also just adherence to policies too. And I just wanted to know, because if maybe you have to explain it to me, but like, is it the same type of branch of, or do you like oversee FSL, make sure they're following policies, or like what's, you know what I mean? Who's in charge of telling them what to do? Because I think sometimes it's hard to be part of a member of FSL and report something without feeling alienated from the rest of the community. So I kind of wanted to know like what you could do to better that relationship between FSL and, you know.
Yeah. So a couple of things. First of all, I appreciate you raising that. I'm not saying that you have to. If you would like to talk about any specific issues, even if they're past issues, even if it's not something you say, you know what, I really want to do it. If you just want to, that's helpful to me in understanding areas that we need to improve on, things that happened in the past. So even without, again, being like formal, you know, like making formal reports and things like that, even just getting an understanding what the issues are. If you would like to talk to me about that in a more, you know, private or more confidential setting after this, I'm very happy to do that. Okay. Just to, again, just sort of understand what's going on. In a larger sense, I don't, as an individual, nor does my office oversee fraternity and sorority life. Okay. However, with respect to issues of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct or other forms of harassment or discrimination, for those issues specifically, my office oversees those issues everywhere at the university. So whether it's in athletics, whether it's in fraternity and sorority life, whether it's in an academic unit or in human resources or in a workplace setting, anytime those issues come up, I am ultimately, and my office is responsible for making sure that people are following our policies and our processes and really our value system related to those issues. Anytime somebody has a concern or a question about anything related to that, they can come directly to me or directly to my office. Okay. If they go, I'm also not naive, right? So people don't always know about me or my office. And so it's naturally, they might go to their boss first. They might go to FSL first. They might go to their organizational advisor, whatever it is first. If they're not satisfied with the answer that they get from that person or from that place, they can always come to us. All right. And if we think that there's an issue there, I do have the authority to intervene and make sure that people and offices and units are doing what it is they're supposed to do as it relates to those issues. And so I think that kind of answers your question, is that no, we don't oversee fraternity and sorority life, but yes, we do have authority to oversee what they do with respect to these issues, or with anybody else and what they do with respect to these issues. And again, if you'd like to talk about that, I would love to talk about it. Again, just to understand, even historically, like what kind of stuff's been going on, where we can strengthen relationships and communication, where we can get out and get in front of, do additional, sometimes it's as easy as doing additional staff trainings so that people have a little bit better of an understanding about exactly what's supposed to be going on. So when they hear issues, they don't give the answer they think is right. They either give the answer that is right, or they tell people where to go to get the right answer, you know? So I hope that was helpful. I hope that answered your question.
I have a follow-up to that, and then a separate question. But I also used to be a member of Greek Life, and I don't know if this is really your domain, but I had a lot of complaints, I guess, on just the way that like formal recruitment was held within fraternities versus sororities. Like, just very basic overview. Fraternities are like, we're watching the Sixers game at our house and roasting a pig. Like, come through if you want, and if we like you, we'll give you a bid. Sorority recruitment is like, you spend X amount of time at each house. It's completely unbiased. You're in an alphabetical line. You can't talk. You have a dress code. You can't use your phone. Like, everything has to be completely like unbiased. You can't talk to anybody else because they don't want any opinions to influence your decision, which I think is like valuable in its own way. But it's just like the women are the only people who have to go through that process, and the frats are like, come through if you want, we'll decide if you want you to be a part of our chapter. Like, it's so casual, and that's obviously like a national issue because this is something that is in, I guess, like Greek life across the entire nation. But that's something that I've like thought about and complained over so many times because I think it just seems like ridiculous. So who at Drexel would be the person that I would like bring that issue up to?
So, well, it'd be helpful to understand. So when you're talking about recruitment practices for Greek organizations, are you talking about the process that is this a part of a process that's mandated through the university, through FSL, through the organizations, through the nationals? Like, is it just a chapter by chapter thing? They say, well, we do recruitment how we want, and, you know, is it somewhere in the middle? Like, how is that done?
I suppose it's somewhere in the middle because every individual chapter is going to have national policies attached to the way that they can do things. There's mostly discrepancies in the like pledging process itself. I think that's like an outdated term that people try not to use anymore, but that's like what it is. Like the rushing experience, I guess. Like certain chapters will allow you to be able to, like certain chapters it will be a completely dry pledge. Some chapters are like, you cannot party with older sisters. Some of them will have like very specific traditions around, I know like my sorority didn't allow us to decorate paddles because they used to be a tool for hazing. So like that is not a tradition that is within my chapter, but within other chapters on campus, paddles are like a big like ceremony where you pass it on or whatever. So formal recruitment is I suppose like a Drexel mandated event. It's typically around a week. When I went through recruitment, it was 4 days. And there's been a lot of changes to the way it's been run since then, but like that was Pan-Hellenic Council's domain. And so that was overseen by FSL and the PHC coordinator, who at the time was Olivia Farkas, I think. And I know that like there was an issue with students who were walking in groups, you know, dressed up for recruitment, and there were like fraternity guys sitting on the porches catcalling them. And so something that was changed there by people voicing their concerns was the next year there was a monetary fine, and that your chapter would be charged like, I don't even know, $500, and you couldn't participate in Greek Week. It was like something very harsh to try and combat that. So I guess like people had issues that they spoke up about, and change was seen. but I think that it pretty much is all within PHC, which is a student-run organization.
Yeah.
I just want to say before Paul, for you jump on that, Alex also has something that she wanted to just add on to Caroline, which might make it a little bit more succinct as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I didn't want to interrupt you, Caroline, but so I'm actually in Greek life currently, and I'm like a newer member. So the sorority and the Greek life, they have like two like national organizations that are very different from each other, and like the panel and a council, which I'm a part of, it's very much so strict. It's like, I will definitely agree with Caroline. Like, we have so many more regulations and policies than I have ever seen like the fraternity like side do. And unfortunately, the person who oversees like fraternity and sorority life, like he doesn't, when we ask questions about it, like we asked about like how specific cases were handled between fraternities and sororities, and he just kind of gave us like very vague answers. So I don't even know if there is a way to change the rushing process, but there is definitely like a need to change like the culture around it.
Yeah. So this is kind of a fascinating conversation that is really nuanced, because, and this is how a lot of this stuff comes to me. I sort of am, when I ask these questions, I'm sort of like constantly sort of in my head, sort of figuring out what the avenues are. So on the one hand, right, so if Drexel, for example, was setting up different rules for recruitment processes that were requiring one thing for fraternities and then something different for sororities, that's a problem, period and point blank, right? Unless there's some narrow exception, okay? So that would be an issue. But short of that, that doesn't mean that there aren't issues just because it's not something as overt as that, right? There are cultural issues, and this is where I think we were starting to get to. There are cultural issues to talk about. There are national organizational issues to talk about, and really, again, there are more values-based decisions to talk about. You've talked about some of the changes that have happened with what sound like, again, some pretty egregious sort of circumstances, but I would love to talk more, and we probably don't have time here today, but if you all have the time or the energy, I would love for us to set up some more time so I can hear a little bit more about this, because it may be something where we say, you know what, there is an environment, right? Or there may be a feeling here, a climate here in Greek life here at the university where, you know, the fraternal organizations get treated a little bit different than the sororities do. And whether that's something that we address, you know, on a organizational level. Okay. So I think that's something that we could talk about, and I would love to talk about that. And so both Caroline and Alex, if you all are willing, if you have some time, I might reach out after this to see if we can find some time to talk.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would
Okay.
be.
Yeah.
I have one last question about the Title IX document, if we have time.
Yeah.
And I think that it's been at the forefront of my mind with these changes, and so I wanted to talk about it in front of other people because it seems like a particularly Drexel specific piece of this documentation is this idea of off-campus housing. And I wanted to know where American campus housing apartments come into play there, because they're considered student housing, but they're not Drexel buildings. So what does that look like in terms of reporting?
So the true answer to that is I'm not 100% sure yet. I will be sure soon, right? We're going to have to understand that issue more fully and make a decision here very, very soon, very soon. It was a decision that we didn't have to make in the same way before, right? Because if you remember, under the prior administration, geography didn't matter. It didn't matter. So if it was right off campus, if it was, 50 miles away, it was the same thing. If that particular situation came back and sort of touched the campus, right, impacted the campus environment, then that was it, right? Now they've drawn much, much clearer lines. Now something that's a block off campus, a half a block off campus, may not necessarily fall under the same jurisdiction, okay? Now, there are wrinkles to that. because what the department has said is they have said, you know, the school can still deal with those issues under a different policy, just not under their Title IX policy, which is a very, very weird way to go about things, because what ends up happening is you could have an incident that happens on campus. You could have the same incident happen 3 blocks away, and it could potentially be handled completely differently, including possibly not at all, right? That's a big deal. You also could have, quite frankly, because the department said, oh, we're doing this to protect due process for people involved, including the accused, right? So that they have all these procedural protections in place in these particular situations. What they fail to consider is, again, if somebody is accused of the very same conduct 3 blocks off campus, we now can't process it under our Title IX policy that has all of these procedural protections, including cross-examination at hearings, full access to investigative files, right? For all these opportunities, all this stuff. Because it was 3 blocks away, they may not be afforded any of those procedural protections for the exact same thing, right? So it's a little bit of a perverse result, right? Like it's an unintended consequence. What we may end up doing is we may end up having 2 policies that essentially say the same thing, but one is basically an on-campus conduct, sexual misconduct policy, and one is an off-campus sexual misconduct policy. If I had to guess, I would guess that that's the direction that we're going to go in. So that ACC property piece, again, that's a thorn in my side, because you're right. It's right there. It's, you know, we do have a relationship with ACC. And so I don't want these weird semantics to like create very real differences in how things get processed. So we're probably going to have 2 processes, but again, that's not 100% certain yet. So don't hold me to it.
How will this affect students on co-op? Will it change how students on co-op are dealt with?
It could, yeah, it could, depending on what the situation is and where it happened. It could very much impact how it's dealt with. It could also not impact how it's dealt with very much, because quite frankly, so for example, if I'm not sure if this is what you're talking about. So a student who reports that they've experienced sexual harassment or something at a co-op site, we're going to deal with that anyway, right? Like, again, the Department of Education hasn't come back and said, oh, you can't deal with that. That's a values-based decision that we're gonna deal with that anyway. We're not gonna have co-op employers and co-op partners who are creating unsafe or unhealthy situations for our students. It's not gonna happen. So that's not gonna change. Is that what you were asking?
Yes, it was. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? I told you, I really could talk about this all night. I suspect that at some point you're going to get bored with me, but.
I mean, this has been so helpful. I feel like I really learned a lot. I think you clarified a lot of things that I had questions about when it came to this document. And I just want to voice that I really appreciate your transparency in saying what has been accomplished and what is still in the works. And I think that Drexel students across the board would really benefit from hearing that from Drexel, you know, even if you're sending out a slightly vague email that has like a broad overview of what's going on. I think just even including a sentence like, this is something we are actively working on and we want you to be sure of that while we do that. I think that like the students at Drexel want to be involved, and they obviously want to be involved with, I say they, like it's not we want to be involved with things that directly have an impact on us. So I think just like I would, as a graduating senior, I would really encourage you to try it and continue to bring your voice into conversations like this, where it's just like open conversation where people can ask questions. I know town halls can be a little intimidating for administration sometimes. And I know that Drexel has kind of like a love-hate relationship with the town halls, because sometimes it's like, it seems like an invitation to bring in everyone with the pitchforks and the torches. But I think it's really important. And I think you guys are doing such great work. So I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to sit down and hear from your perspective, like what processes are going on behind the scenes that I wouldn't know about, even though they have a direct impact on my student experience. So I hope that this can continue throughout the summer as more things come out about this documentation, and even throughout the year. like after it's implemented, just continuing the conversations and checking in with the students and saying like, how are things working? Where are we at fault, and how can we be better? And how can you help us help you?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I very much, I appreciate your time and your energy around this. As Maurice said, hold us accountable, right? You're right. I think a lot of administration, they are nervous about town halls, and sometimes they are nervous about what's too much engagement, right? Because sometimes folks are self-selecting, right? It's the folks who have a pitchfork that show up to the town hall. I don't care, right? Those are exactly the people that I want to hear from. I want to hear the worst case scenario, because that's what we got to fix first, right? That's sort of where we got to go. So after this, I'm going to ask Maurice to make sure that my contact information gets circulated. I would love to continue to hear from any or all of you about any thoughts, ideas, anything. Even after, I know you mentioned a couple times that you're not going to be a student for too much longer. I congratulate you on that. But don't feel like you can't or you shouldn't reach out to me at any point now or in the future with any thoughts or ideas, or just to chat. I'll grab coffee. I'll do whatever.
I very much appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think that's honestly the perfect way to end it. And it's not an ending, it's really more just transitioning to a new thing. The conversation doesn't just stop here. My door is always open, well, my virtual door, and so I can physically see people. I know Paul has stated over and over again, his door is open. And even though people like Caroline might be physically transitioning from Drexel, I'm going to be in contact with her for a very long time. So these conversations need to continue, and I hope it does continue. And that's one of the reasons why we do these types of events in the SCDI, because they're very important. I think that we touched on a great amount of points. I'm going to be sending the recording out to not only everybody who came to it tonight, but to a whole lot of other people. And I'll include Paul's contact information in there as well. So I just want to say thank you to everybody who came. Thank you for Caroline and Paul for spending your time helping to arrange this. And let's keep these conversations going.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Have a great
Thank
night.
you.
Bye.